She is a woman who's living with cancer. She is a woman who is a mother to 2 sons who play hockey and who are very active. She is a wife as well. And in the midst of all of this, she takes some time to reflect on life. And this past Friday, her post began with a quote from Katie Byron. These words: "Life is simple. Everything happens for you, not to you. Everything happens at exactly the right moment, neither too soon or too late. You don't have to like it. It's just easier if you do." It's one of those quotes that you really need to be careful with. If you're a person who's in the midst of a good stretch of life and things are going really well, it's probably not something that you should say to someone else. Oh, it's just at the right time for you. You're likely to get, if they're in the midst of a struggle, well, you don't know me. You don't know what I'm going through. Or you're likely to get silence. Today we find Jesus and 3 of his followers on the mountaintop, and the experience is surreal. Jesus becomes radiant, Moses and Elijah appear and disappear, a bright cloud casts a shadow. This time, the voice that was heard at Jesus' baptism only by Jesus is heard by the disciples as well. The disciples are at the right place, at just the right moment, and something is happening for them. And Jesus says to them, "Don't tell people what you saw. At least not just yet." He doesn't say, "You never saw this." But he does seem to say, "Remember it, but don't tell it. No one will believe it, but don't forget it. You will need it when the struggle comes." The struggle will come. Elijah came to restore all things, and the people did not follow. And so it is, I will suffer too. And the disciples immediately, when he spoke of Elijah's suffering, thought of John the Baptist and his experience of being beheaded by the henchmen of King Herod. It is one thing to claim that God is good and that miracles happen when life is going pretty well. But if the disciples can hang on to this vision of the heavens opening, even after they see the gates of hell open, if they can hang on to this vision after and through and after the crucifixion, if they can hang on to this vision of a good God after living through the baddest parts of life, then they can tell what they've seen and what they've heard. Today we gather around this table. And it's the table where Jesus spoke of his body being broken and his blood being spilled. It is the table where one of those who gathered would run off and betray him. It is the table where the others of those who gathered shared and yet turned away from Jesus for a time. We are invited to that table as well. And we are invited to tell that story of the table over and over again. Because the story of the table is also the story of our hope. In spite of all the bad things associated with it, it has been transformed. It was a table set for us, that we might be set free, that we might not be victims with things happening to us, that we might be made whole and be compassion-filled. It is a story that comes before the cross, which becomes a symbol of healing and triumph, and that is more outlandish or more unbelievable than a person glowing on a mountainside. I've been to the top of mountains, not Mount Everest or anything, but I've been up to the top of lower mountains, and they have the craziest clouds on the top of mountains. They are brighter, and they are darker, and some of those clouds are both. And I remember taking a picture of my son, not on the mountaintops, but when he was little, holding a blanket beside a waterfall. And when I got the picture back, I was amazed that I hadn't seen just how radiant he was, and how dark and shadowed it was right beside him. It was as if he glowed. I remember when I was a child, and you probably remember this too, the first time you lost someone you loved. My first someone was the dog Copper, our little dog. Even after he passed away, I remember I would look over and I would see him laying on the couch. And I knew he wasn't there, but I was so used to seeing him there. And that's how it is when we lose people. Still, we see them where we used to see them for a time. And whether they're there or not, they're there in our hearts and in our minds for a time. And that isn't to make less of this mountaintop experience, but it is to say that the mountaintop experience wasn't the miracle Jesus was pointing us toward. It was just an experience to remind us of the larger miracle. That miracle is that somehow things do happen for a reason. And they do happen at the right times. And that miracles can be the things that on the surface don't feel like a miracle at all until we look back on them much later. One of the most powerful books I've ever read has the title, Now That I Have Cancer, I'm Whole. It was written by a pastor with cancer who had a 70% chance statistically of not living for 2 years, and he began to journal his experience. And one of the entries on page 41, in fact, says, "Now that I have cancer, I am in control." And truth was, he was in control of even less than he was before, and yet, now that he had cancer, he began to describe being in control of two things, his attitude and what he would do with his limited energy each day. Who he would live for, what priorities he would set, how it in a way set him free. His wife began to say it wasn't that he was in control, but that he was out of control, because he wasn't being controlled by all the things that used to control him. It was what God and he decided to do with each day, where he was feeling most called to be and what he was feeling most called to do. The world is filled with things that bring us down, but we follow a Jesus who lived through the worst of it, the judgment, the abandonment, the pain, the rejection, the broken body, the spilled blood, and transformed that somehow into wholeness. He took what the world threw at him, and it brought him low, and then God raised him up. And that is our promise, that God will raise us up in the midst of it all. We are about to step forth into these 40 days of Lent, and Ash Wednesday it begins. And we are about to remember that part of our life that does challenge us, that part of our life that brings us low. And we will need to cling to whatever mountaintop experiences we have. We will need to cling to the promise in the bread and the cup, to hang tightly to anything that gives us life. That's not a bad way to live all of the year. These things are an invitation to choose our attitude, to choose our activities, to live for the hope that has been promised to us, and to claim that powerful presence of God with us all the time, even those times when we don't see it, to believe and to know it is still there. When you hear it, God is still whispering, "You are my beloved son. You are my beloved daughter." Can you see it? Even now, Jesus is standing alongside you. And those two truths can change everything. sphere.